showcasing research topics from UNL as well as speakers from around the world. Speakers will be entirely virtual this year through Zoom. Seminars will be Wednesday, 3:30 to 4:30. Next week's seminar will be Tatiana Haidt, a UNL alumni. She will give her talk, Black Environmentalists Matter, Culturally Relevant Approaches to Environmental Programming and Curricula. To minimize disruption from Zoom bombers in today's seminar, we had the chats directed only to the hosts. So after the talk, if you have any questions, please type your questions into the chat and direct them to me, Judy Turk. And I will read the questions for everyone. Please keep your video turned off during the seminar to preserve bandwidth. The seminar will be recorded, so please contact me or Chris Chizinski if you need access to the recording later. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Asmeret Asefaw Berhe. Dr. Berhe is Professor of Soil Biogeochemistry, Velasco Chair in Earth Science at the Life Science and Environmental Science Department, and Interim Associate Dean of the Graduate Division of the University of California-Merced. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Asmeret, master's in political ecology from Michigan State University, and her PhD in biogeochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley. She has earned many awards in her field, including the National Science Foundation's Career Award, Fellow and Brommery Award from the Geological Society of America, and is a member of the inaugural class of the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's New Voices in Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Dr. Berhe's research focuses on biogeochemical cycling of essential elements in soil systems, global change science, nanogeochemistry, political ecology of land degradation and ownership. Please welcome Dr. Berhe.
Thank you so much, Judy, for inviting me to speak to your community, as well as for this really generous introduction. Today, I will focus my presentation on work that we've been doing in my group about having to do with deep soil organic matter dynamics. And I'll start by trying to convince you that deep soils are important. It's important to think about the entire soil profile as much as possible, even for climate change related discussions. And I'll give you kind of highlight of a few different types of projects that we've been doing in my group in this respect. So to start. So generally speaking, the work, I don't know if there's a way for me to, I think you all hear the ding when people come in, but it doesn't seem to be a good way for me to not hear that because I'm a co-host and you all will get to hear it, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But generally speaking, so in my lab, I am fortunate to work with a dynamic group of grad students, postdocs, and other researchers to ask questions around how and why organic matter persists in soil. And that takes us to basically lets us explore questions around biogeochemical cycles of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, including cycling of pyrogenic carbon, which is the fire-altered carbon that remains after fires or even is applied in the form of biochar. Within these contexts, we ask a lot of questions having to do with how and why, physical perturbations in the environment, such as erosion or fire or global change variables that have to do with temperature change or even change in the amount, timing of precipitation, how those affect rate of cycling of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, how they affect accumulation of these elements in the soil system or their bioavailability for essential biological processes. We also spend a lot of time thinking about their lateral and vertical transport within the soil profile, as well as export into aquatic systems, and its implication for how we imagine these cycles to play out in the global scale, for example. As I mentioned, we spent a lot of time thinking about the stability or persistence of carbon, for example, in the soil system. And that has a lot to do with physical and chemical associations that organic matter forms in soil with reactive soil minerals, which are typically nano-sized by nature. And so that's the nanogeochemistry part. And then on the larger scale, I like to think a lot about these dynamic two-way relationships of human communities with land, including the use, overuse, and abuse of land that causes degradation, for example, which is a very prevalent global problem because of human actions. And then infer on what is the implication of soil degradation and change in soil that we are observing currently for the security of human communities, including national security type of considerations. As you could see from here, then that kind of the work that we do covers a range of spatial and temporal scales and lets us explore a lot of dynamic ecosystems here in California and elsewhere. So before I go any further, I wanted to highlight that I mentioned we study the accumulation, stability, persistence, and dynamics of organic matter in soil. And I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about what that is and why we do that. So organic matter, broadly speaking, is a collection of diverse types of organic compounds that exist in soil, mainly as a result of accumulation of detritus from plants and animals that call the soil home, that may exist at range different stages of decomposition. And it also includes living microbial biomass and organic compounds that are synthesized by microbes, so products of those microbial activities. And these organic compounds, typically, if you were to think about it from a mass perspective, the mass of organic matter relative to the mass of whole soil, at best maybe 5%, if you will. But generally speaking, most of the soils mineral soils that folks study have organic matter concentration somewhere on the order of about 1 to 6 or so %. So it's relatively very small proportion of soil, but that small proportion of soil though comes with this diversity of organic compounds that each have their own functional groups that are highlighted in colors in the top right corner of your screen. And all of that means that organic matter endows the soil with a lot of reactivity, but also a lot of beneficial properties that are the reason why the soil system is able to support life. So for example, soils that have a lot of organic matter also have stable physical structure. They're able to retain water and nutrients very well and even play key roles in thermal balance because organic matter makes soils darker color, typically speaking. So that tends to have huge implications for physical processes in soil. Organic matter is also the main food and energy source for all the biota that call soil home, in particular microorganisms and microbiota, or flora, I should say, and hence regulates their abundance and diversity and even their resilience if they were to experience some change or perturbation. And chemically speaking, soils that have a lot of organic matter tend to also have high cation exchange capacity or ability of soil to hold on and exchange plant essential nutrients, in particular cations in this case, and even have high potential to buffer against pH changes and can complex a number of metals. So all of this is to say that that relatively small proportion of mass that organic matter accounts for is very critical for these crucial biological, physical, and chemical processes in soil. And I want to also highlight that soils are amazing. Soils are dynamic, right? And their soils tend to be the most complex biomaterial that we know of anywhere on the Earth system. And a big part of the structural chemical complexity of soils is actually attributed to the diversity, structure, and dynamics of organic matter. So organic matter is quite significant component of how the soils function, the reason why soils are able to support life, and even the reason why soils play a major role in climate change mitigation. I'm going to talk about that near the end. But I'll start with trying to convince you why I think it's important to think about soils as a whole profile. So looking deeper, basically, how we need to do, why we need to dig deeper to understand dynamics of organic matter in the whole soil profile. And I'll give you a few examples from studies that we've done over the years that allude to large amount of carbon that's stored in deep soils, and even stability and climate sensitivity of that carbon stored in deep soil layers, and how it can play very important roles in climate change mitigation going forward. So to start with, I assume most of you know somewhat about carbon accumulation in soils. Soils tend to have a lot of carbon. There's a lot of work that's done trying to understand how much carbon stored in soil, how is it stabilized, the role of microbes, for example, in processing this organic matter and everything else. But a lot, overwhelming majority of the data that we currently have on soil organic matter dynamics, or most soil processes for that matter, is really concentrated on topsoils, especially work related to microbial community dynamics, and organic matter tends to be concentrated typically in the top 10 or 20 centimeter of soil. Every once in a while, folks go down to 50 or even 100 centimeters depth. But there's really not much data about what's going on in terms of even carbon storage, organic matter dynamics below 1 meter soil depth. And I want to highlight that there are real reasons why people have not necessarily pushed beyond that 1 meter depth too much up to this point. Part of the justifications that are given is that there's most of the organic matter is located in topsoil. That's where you have highest concentration of organic matter. And this is also the part of the soil profile that's most biologically active. And from a perspective of agriculture, in particular, shallow-rooted and short-lived agricultural crops, what matters really is organic matter, for the most part, I should say, is the amount of organic matter and nutrients that are available in the top part of the soil, and the top part of the soil's ability to hold on to water and be able to provide it to plants. And because change in atmospheric climate also significantly affects topsoil more than they do subsoil layers, the topsoil layer is most vulnerable to change in climate. And there's a bunch of other reasons too. So this is the justification that's given for why why the emphasis on topsoil has been prevalent up till this point. But obviously soils are way more than what you see in the top 10, 20 centimeters, or even 100 centimeters. There was a recent study that indicated that on average, the data that's available on published literature on carbon and nitrogen is roughly extends to about 23 centimeters. But most soils around the world, if you were to take an average, are at the very least 6 feet, or at least half of that in terms of depth. Okay, so as I mentioned, topsoils are given a lot of emphasis because of this high concentration of carbon and biological activity in near the topsoils. And I'm here trying to argue that whole soil profile perspective is really critical. And as much as possible, we need to look at the soil all the way down to bedrock contact. And there are processes that are critical even to be able to distinguish between what's happening in the different major soil horizons, A, B, and C. But that brings me to an interesting conundrum that a lot of folks have been wondering around in soil science for as long as the science existed. What exactly does that deep soil really mean? We don't actually have a well agreed upon definition of what deep soil is. By most accounts, it tends to be the soil layer that's below 30 centimeter, which is close to the plow layer in agricultural systems, and also maybe encompasses most A horizon in soil layers, in soil profiles. So I illustrate this kind of conundrum and difficulty that people have had with the defining what exactly is deep soil and where do we draw the line. I show you this figure from a paper that Dan Richter and Darren Marquardt published many years ago at this point, about 25 years ago, to illustrate that, soils are diverse, first of all, to start with. Soils vary around the world based on what we recognize as the state factors of soil formation. So as a function of the parent material from which they're formed, the climate, the biota, the relief or topography of the ecosystem that they've been formed in, and how long the soil forming processes have been active. As a result, you have diversity of soils around the world. And in the US classification scheme, we recognize, for example, these 4 soils that are listed here. There are 4 of the 12 soil orders in the US soil classification system. And they vary basically in that entasol is the youngest, least weathered, kind of least developed soils that we recognize, and altisol is near the most weathered scales, not the most weathered, but it's close. And what you notice here is that as soils weather over time, the depth of the parent material gets, so basically how far you have to go from the surface to reach the parent material, which in this case is R, obviously increases, right? Soils increase in thickness over time as they're weathering, and the depths of the A, B, and C horizons also change. The C horizon is typically a layer that had not really received much consideration from the perspective of the organic matter community or even the climate community so far. And that's the focus for the work that we've done and that I will show you results in the first part. And I mentioned that there's emphasis on topsoil. So typically when you've seen data that describes soil maybe up to depth of resistance, it's talking about up to the boundary between the B and C horizon typically, because C horizon is saprolite, so soil that, rock that has been weathering in place. So relatively speaking, it's denser, it would crumble if you were to take out the load of the A and B horizon, but it's hard and it doesn't have much roots or even typically much loose and consolidated matter that you can easily distinguish. And hence, so if people were sampling within an auger and used, that as a guide to sample up to the depth of resistance, they probably would go very likely to the boundary of the B and the C horizon, which can vary, right? Obviously, the B horizon develops along as soils develop, and is the zone of accumulation of material that was transported from the topsoil layers, in particular by the actions of water. But for the most part, C horizon really has not been a part of how we've thought about carbon accounting. But I find it very interesting because not only is that important, but generally speaking, deep soils tend to be really fascinating in my opinion. Because you could have deep soils that are formed for many different reasons. Sometimes it's because the weathering conditions are so optimal for both the physical and biogeochemical weathering, like you see in the middle figure right here, or even the right figure, that and cause deeply weathered soils to accumulate. So you have a very thick layer of weathered soil or unconsolidated material that we typically recognize as A and B horizon or even CR layers accumulate in the soil. But every once in a while, you could also have deep soils that are formed because of lateral transport of topsoil. So the one that you see on your left here, the list deposit, is a paleosol in Nebraska known as the Berhe soil. It's actually very close to you all, and a reason why we've spent some time in your part of the country, where these soils are fascinating in themselves because of how much mass has been transported by wind, aeolian transport processes and deposition in this area. In some part, this part of the soils that we studied here extend, but in other parts in the area, the soils can extend well past 30 meters in depth. Imagine how much movement has to happen by wind over how long periods of time for this much carbon and for this much soil, and most importantly, soil, to accumulate over a given area. So if we were to focus our efforts, even in this in this less deposit in Nebraska, if we were to focus our efforts, you know, on the first 10, 20, or even 50 centimeters, we wouldn't even get a fifth of the story of carbon dynamics in these soils, let alone the entire story, right? And this is the middle soil profile where it's featuring one of my students, Morgan Barnes, who's been studying these soils for phosphorus dynamics, but also is a collaborator on the carbon story. These soils are also fascinating, and I'm hoping to convince you that there's an interesting reason why we should keep looking, digging deeper into these soils. Okay. So we're going to see some data from the deep soils in the Sierras in a minute, but for some reason, the slides are not advancing. Okay, here. So there's many reasons why carbon can make it into deep soil layers, as I had showed you a minute ago. And I just want to go over them one more time before we go to the data. So you can find carbon in deep soil layers. For example, if you have deep, extensive rooting systems and those plants are growing with deep roots, then obviously we'll deposit a lot of carbon in deep soil layers. And we also know that root-derived carbon tends to be preserved quite effectively in soil. So typically soils with deep-rooted plants, especially perennial deep-rooted plants, tend to have a lot of carbon. Think, for example, a lot of the mollisols, very organic and nutrient-rich soils that you have in the central parts of the US, for example, that were formerly covered in prairies that are now agricultural areas. This would be the main mechanism why you have carbon. You can also have carbon relocated to deeper soil layers because of biological activity that mixes the soil, including through activity of tree roots, but also gophers and other agents of biotubation, so burrowing mammals. You can also have a lot of carbon that could be relocated into deep soil layers with transport of dissolved organic matter or water. So typically in the dissolved form in this case. And here you're seeing evidence of two soils, both of them fairly well weathered, that where water has been moving down the soil profile. And as you see with the differences in color, it's taking away with it dark organic matter, rich water, where then it leaves some of that organic matter on the path of these fractures and tongues along the soil profile. We also know that frost ice tends to relocate a lot of carbon into deep soil layers. This is evidence of cryotubation or ice churning that has accumulated carbon in deep soil layers. And the last buried soils, which could be soils that where you had some agents that transported soil from one location and deposited it in other places. These are common in the less deposits, including the example from Nebraska I showed you, which is the same soil, actually the Berhe soil that's depicted in this middle figure. But you could also have similar things happen in alluvial deposits, for example, floodplains and things like that. And this is also very common when burial occurs due to volcanic activity in soils that are located in areas with active volcanism. Okay. A lot of what we've learned in the last, in particular, 2 decades on deep soil organic matter highlights that, one, there's potential for there to be a lot of carbon in deep soil layers, and that carbon is also very likely cycling relatively slowly compared to carbon in in shallow soil layers. So these are radiocarbon depths from 4 studies that show basically how old the carbon is or how fast it's cycling in these systems. The values obviously are very short, relatively speaking, near the surface, where you have continuous photosynthesis taking up atmospheric CO2 with its unique signature of 14C, compared to carbon that is in deep soil layers, which is typically older and hence has survived in these systems up to 10, 12,000 years. And then works, including one that was done at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and one that was done in our group Min et al. Is a current postdoc in my group, KJ, has shown that deep soil organic matter can also be sensitive to climate. And so I'm going to show you the example from our site in a minute. And part of the reason why this is important from a climate perspective, for example, is that so far we've been assuming that a large proportion of the CO2 that's released from soil to the atmosphere is coming from the soil surface or layers really close to the soil surface. But in reality, there is evidence to suggest that up to half of that CO2 could actually be derived from deep soil layers below 30 centimeters. And if that's the case, and if these deep soils are sensitive to climate change, then it becomes really important to think about how management activities, for example, could change that. Okay, so taking you to the first set of results from our own work, I first want to orient you that we're talking about sites located on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, which unfortunately, including one of these sites, is very close to the areas that are burning right now. Many of you have seen the news on the fires. So our Suproot site is actually has fires that are just about a mile or so away from it. The cameras are showing very disastrous results right now. Everybody's worried, as you can imagine. But what we can learn from the western slope of the Sierra is that it's a pretty neat chronos sequence, meaning it's a pretty neat climal sequence, I should say, meaning the soils along the elevation gradient have developed in roughly similar conditions with similar parent material, for example, but with climate systematically varying along the elevation gradient, which means we see evidence of soil weathering as a function of climate and development by climate and its effect on soil weathering. As a result, when we explore the depth of soil in these areas, we see some significant different results. And the D figure that I've added right here on the top right section is basically showing you the depth of soil across these elevation sequence. So as you go higher in elevation, you start seeing deeper and deeper and deeper soils. So if you just focus on the layers that we typically sample for soil and soil organic matter related work, typically speaking, the depths extend from about 120 or so in the lowest elevation site in the San Joaquin experimental range, which is an oak savanna kind of ecosystem. As you move on to the mixed conifer and even the mixed pine and oak forest and the mixed pine and oak in Suproot, and then mixed conifer at Providence and the subalpine forest, you see that soil depth in the A, B, and C horizons, so the lighter color here, increases until you achieve about 2 meters of depth of that. But if you are actually to look at the whole soil profile perspective and consider the entire weathered soil layer, so everything that's distinct from the parent material, basically speaking, then you start seeing even more significant change. So there is this CR layer or weathered bedrock that's underlaying these soil layers that could extend all the way up to 10 meters below the soil surface. So along with 2 graduate students in my group that you see in the figure, Kimber Moreland and Morgan Barnes that I showed you in the other figure too, and collaborators from the Southern Sierra Critical Zone Observatory, we set out to ask how much carbon is stored in this CR layer, and should it really matter in the larger scheme of things, or can we just understand everything we need to understand about carbon dynamics in soil if we just sample A or even A and B plus C horizons? And so we set out to do this work, which involved, obviously, as you can imagine, geoprobing all the way to which thankfully to the NSF support that funded the Southern Sierra Critical Zone Observatory, we were able to get. And then we quantified how much carbon is in these layers. So what you see in this figure, which is a little busy, so I'll go over it with you, is as you go up in elevation, it's broken down the carbon inventory in the soil, meaning the A plus B and C layers that I first showed you that extended max to about 2 meters. And then what proportion of the total carbon is also located in that weathered bedrock or CR layer. So as you would imagine, as you go up in elevation, temperature starts dropping as you would imagine, right? It gets colder in higher elevation systems, but more importantly, it also gets wet. And as it gets wet, you have this mid-elevation site where it's a perfect, basically, optimal location for physical and biogeochemical weathering. So where it's warm, but not too warm or too cold, and then you have a lot of water that's delivered in the form of rain and not just snow as you would have in the higher elevation systems. You start seeing very deep soils develop as you saw in the earlier slide. But these deep soils also translate into large amounts of carbon that's stored in soil. So up to close to 20 kilograms per meter square, we start seeing just in the A, B, and C layers. But then what's even more interesting to me is how as you get closer and closer and into that, and you get to that optimal weathering zone, you start noticing largest amount of carbon that's actually stored in that CR layer. And important to note here that the percent carbon in the CR layer is not terribly huge. In fact, in most cases, it's about 0.2, if not lower, percent. But that amount of carbon extends so deep into the soil, as you saw, up to 10 meters, that it adds up, right? So by the time you reach the mixed conifer ecosystem, at about 2,000 meters in elevation, you have close to 30% of the carbon in soil is actually stored in this deep weathered layer. Most important variable predicting how much of this how much carbon you're likely to have in the CR layer seems to be deep water percolation, which is this variable that is derived as precipitation minus ET. And what that's telling you basically is that this is a measure of how much water actually goes down the soil profile, right? Not just how much water is coming from precipitation, but take out all the water that plants need for evapotranspiration, and that doesn't really necessarily make it into the deep layers, right? But if you take that out and you just think about how much water are these soils actually seeing in deep soil layers, that becomes the most important predictor for amount of carbon that could be stored in deep soil layers and even weathered bedrock. So to me, it was fascinating. We started with the curiosity of, can there be a lot of carbon in these weathered bedrock? And we ended up with 30% of the carbon in soil that can be stored in weathered bedrock. So hugely important, obviously. And we did a lot of calculations to try and understand how likely is it that this deep weathered bedrock can contribute to large amounts of carbon stored in soils globally. So we worked with the pedologist Toby Eugene and his student Tian in trying to extrapolate what we learned from the climate sequence in the Sierra Nevada to the world. So basically, based on what we know about distribution of different types of bedrocks and different types of, so not just paramaterial, but also the climate under which these soils would have to weather, how likely is it that we can expect these types of deep weathered bedrock around the world? And we came up with multiple scenarios that assume that soils around the world are only extend about 1 meter below the surface, or accounting for what we observe, the entire profile, or assume that they might have saprock that could extend up to 5 meters. And the most likely scenario that we've derived is that, globally speaking, if our estimates of the distribution of these weathered bedrock soils with deep weathered bedrock is accurate, anywhere even close to being accurate, then we're looking at additional 200 petagrams of carbon that's stored in weathered bedrock that so far has never really been accounted for in any of the global carbon schemes that we know of. And you might say 200 petagrams of carbon is not really a lot in the larger scheme of things, because we think soils have somewhere on the order of about 2,700 petagrams of carbon total. Yeah, you'd be right? That's close to 10%, but not even quite. But this additional number, though, is really important because it actually is bigger than the hidden soil carbon that a lot of global carbon models discuss. That is not clear exactly what it is, but it looks like it's in the Earth system, somewhere on land, potentially speaking. So chances are that the reason why we have, part of the reason at least we haven't been able to balance the global carbon cycle might lie on the fact that we just simply did not look deep enough. And that if we accounted deep soil layers, would at least get closer to a more accurate accounting of global carbon stock. Okay, so that was kind of like the large story. And the next part I wanted to highlight a little bit about nature and stability of near surface versus deep soil layers. And I want to remind you again that soils vary in terms of how carbon is distributed. So near the top, you're very likely to see more particulate organic matter, even higher concentration of dissolved organic matter, higher percent carbon, more plant-derived components. But in deeper soil layers, you're more likely to see microbially processed organic matter that is more likely associated with the minerals and is even presumably older in age. And hence, we have to account for the fact that as water moves through the soil profile, there is continuous sorption-desorption processes that are, making sure that some of the carbon at least is preserved in soil, especially in deep soil layers where you have a lot of reactive minerals. And in the same time, you also have aggregation. Whenever you have organic matter and reactive minerals, you could expect that aggregates would form, and those aggregates are also dynamically taking out some of the carbon that's moving down the soil and stabilizing it for long periods of time. And if that's true, then if we go back to the data set from the same site that I showed you in Sierra Nevada, when we look at the ratio of carbon to nitrogen in soil, or even use Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy to get an idea of the chemical composition of organic matter, and radiocarbon to look at its mean residence time or how fast it's cycling, we end up with data that looks like this. And a lot of the wiggles in the first two plots in particular are basically telling you that there is some dynamic fluctuation in the composition of organic matter that's happening all the way down to 10 meters and beyond, right? Which means there's some carbon that's being preserved without being processed, terribly highly processed, right? Say for example, at carbon to nitrogen ratios of about 30 at 400 centimeters or 4 meters below the soil surface is likely suggesting that there are some particulate forms of organic matter, or at least poorly processed organic matter persisting in that layer for long periods of time. And we also see that so there's input of new carbon is what kind of basically part of what I'm trying to get at. But generally speaking, we notice that even with the input of new carbon, deep soil organic matter is preserved for long periods of time. In particular, once you get past about 500 or so centimeters or 5 meters below the soil surface, you start seeing organic matter that's really old. At the deepest point that we've measured here, near 5 meters below the soil surface, the age of carbon that we've dated with radiocarbon suggests that it is about 20,000 years old. So once carbon makes it into these deep layers through movement of dissolved organic matter, biotubation, or roots that may die down there, whatever it's bringing the carbon there, it suggests that once it makes it there, it persists for really long periods of time, way longer than we would expect for pretty much any type of organic compound. And so important considerations globally. And then the next point that I wanted to make is from an actually eroding hill slope, where you have transport of topsoil from eroding positions and their ultimate deposition in two types of depositional basins, in a terrestrial depression as well as an alluvial-colluvial plain. And what this shows you is that this transport of topsoil from hill slopes to these depositional positions, one, contributes to close to half of the total carbon inventory of the depositional settings being below 30 centimeter or in subsoil. And not only is it half, but it's also contributing to offset of quite a proportion, more than 50% of the carbon that is coming through. So more than 50% of the carbon that's coming in from plant productivity into these deep layers, the net input of carbon into the soil organic carbon pool is being offset by decay of carbon in these deep soil layers, meaning these soils are clearly not preserving the carbon for eternity. It's dynamic even in these deep layers. Because we were motivated by that question, we asked questions with Johann Six when he was started when he was at Davis, UC Davis, work on these instrumented plots located at the UC Davis campus to measure CO2 fluxes at different soil layers, and then be able to think about how that changes with changing moisture conditions. I won't go too much into the detail of the experimental setup, but I put the reference right there if folks would be interested. The paper was recently published. So as you would expect, you see large fluctuation of CO2 fluxes in soil overall speaking near the soil surface than down below. But what we did with this experiment was we observed the soil for long periods of time under ambient conditions. I cut the ambient short here just for reference. And then we used sprinkler systems to irrigate the soil and wet it. These are 3 plots, and I'm showing you average of the 3 instrumented plots at the different depths. And then we wetted it with, and then we waited for that soil to start drying and observe the pattern of CO2 fluxes. And this allows us to basically ask questions of, do deep soil layers behave similarly during wetting than they do during drying? Are they similarly going to respond to short-term change in precipitation patterns and temperature and things like that? Because we've instrumented it to look at CO2, moisture, oxygen, temperature, and a bunch of other things, we were able to then derive relationships that show us how does CO2 concentration at the different depths change as a function of changing precipitation as well as temperature. So what the data that you're looking at here suggests is that, if you look at the green dots are basically what is going on during ambient precipitation. So during ambient conditions, when the soils are not exposed to rapid change in environmental conditions, if you will, you see that deep soil layers the CO2 concentration in deep soil layers doesn't change much with, and also the temperature doesn't fluctuate too much in deep soil layers, right? So it's basically a very small change that you observe with depth. But once you start applying moisture, and now you're observing the relative change in CO2 concentration as a function of temperature that's happening during wetting of soil versus during drying of soil, you see very divergent results. So because when soil is drying, we see that deep soil CO2 becomes more sensitive to change in temperature. And overall, we also observed that change in CO2 production, where the driving force for the observed change in CO2 concentration as a function of temperature that we observed both during ambient and drying. So microbes responded differently, and we see this really different sensitivity of deep CO2 to change in climate and weather in this case. Okay, so should we care about this when we're thinking about climate change, in particular natural climate change solutions that involve soils? I think yes. Before I move into that, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in realizing that soil stores large amounts of carbon, way more than atmosphere and vegetation combined, hence play an important role in regulating the Earth's climate by controlling flux of greenhouse gases in and out of the soil with respect to the atmosphere. But we also know that soils can release large amounts of carbon if they're not managed right. But if they are managed right, then they could store quite significant amount and contribute to climate change mitigation. If you've never seen a figure that looks like that, this is just a way to highlight that. If you look across the world in different types of biomes, the carbon density in soil is considerably bigger than we see in vegetation. And even if you add atmosphere, soil still comes on top. It stores twice more than carbon than both of these spheres combined, and soil is a very effective carbon bank, if you will, for long-term carbon storage. And part of this is accomplished by the association of otherwise thermodynamically unstable organic compounds that are able to form physical and chemical association with minerals and soil, i.e. that carbon gets trapped inside aggregates or is chemically bound to the surfaces of minerals, making it harder to decompose and hence increasing its persistence in soil system. And if we all agree on that, then the next thing to consider is the fact that any climate change mitigation strategy that takes us forward from where we are right now, we can't afford to leave any option behind, including the fact that in addition to reducing emissions, so decarbonization, in addition to decarbonization to slow the rate of CO2 concentration increase in the atmosphere, we have to be able to manage ecosystems for effective carbon storage. So to take out carbon CO2 from the atmosphere, or negative emissions, if you will, which is the only way we're going to be able to bend the curve on CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere. So, and we know a lot about how to do this, right? One of the things we know is that perennial deep-rooted plants can play very important roles in this respect, partly because, as I told you earlier, that we know that carbon derived from roots tend to be retained quite effectively in soil for long periods of time. So if you look at this figure, then there's a lot of detail here that I'm not necessarily going to focus on, but these are the whole assemblage of climate change solutions that we have, and ranked basically by the average greenhouse gas reduction or removal rates that we can achieve for the different options, and how big of an area globally we can adopt these solutions. So the one that I'm interested on that focuses on deep soil, directly deep soil organic matter storage, has to do with these enhanced root phenotypes, or basically managing soils in a way that we're maximizing the planting of deep-rooted perennial crops. And this is what's happening in a project that we're working on right now across much of the, in particular, the eastern part of the US, central and eastern parts of the US, where we are seeing that soils that were planted, these are fields that are side by side, soils that are planted by deep-rooted perennial, in this case switchgrass, in about 10 years, start outpacing the carbon storage potential of soils that are cultivated with shallow-rooted annuals. And as you can imagine, then this starts to highlight how important it is to focus on deep-rooted perennial systems as part of a climate change mitigation strategy. By some accounts, focusing on, in a lot of managed grasslands or managed lands in general, on how we can work with enhanced root phenotypes for deep-rooted perennial plants, can sequester upwards of 1 petagram CO2 equivalent per year with just this one practice. And the nice thing is this option sits right high on this graph, which suggests that there is a lot of global area we can implement these types of management practices on. And so I hope I've convinced you that deep soils are really important because first, they store large amounts of the carbon that we know of in the Earth system, even in the weathered bedrock, and can even be part of the reason why we haven't been able to account for this hidden carbon that has prevented closing of the carbon budget in the world. But I think I'll caution there that it's not just all optimistic. We have a lot of questions around the sensitivity, or especially climate sensitivity, and how active deep soil carbon is, and whether this becomes even bigger problem in some ecosystems, such as permafrost and during warming, or even climate change across the world in general. In general, I think that furthering our understanding of subsoil carbon stability, persistence, and its composition is really important from a just purely scientific endeavor, if you will, to understand how carbon is distributed, how soils store carbon, but at the same time is also really critical component of any climate smart land management practices that we have to implement at this point. With that, I'll end, but I don't want to end without mentioning that a lot of the data and work that I've talked about here was generated by students and postdocs in my lab, but also a large number of collaborators across these ecosystems that we've been working together. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, you can type them into the chat and I'd be happy to read them for you.
Okay, I'll take myself out of share screen so that we could see folks.
While we're waiting for any questions to come through on the chat, I can ask a question that is maybe a little bit, I don't know, tedious and soil specific, but I've heard some debate about the best way to sample soil profiles for carbon, whether it's best to sample by predetermined depth increments or on the basis of soil horizons. Do you have any thoughts on which of those approaches is the best, and how did you approach that when you were doing your deep soil carbon sampling?
Ask like a real pedologist. You know what my answer is going. If I have a choice, I think I would prefer people sample soils by genetic horizons, only because it's a lot more representative. It's also easier to scale that up than just random predetermined depths. But I also recognize that even in my lab, we have regularly, many times, sampled by predetermined depth intervals, simply because in many cases, we don't have the chance or the opportunity or even capacity to dig pits in some areas. So in those cases, we have to use augers or we have to use geoprobes or something where we can't really say with the genetic horizons where they start and end. So we just have to work with what we've got, and predetermined depths tend to be the way we can work in that case. But if folks have if they have a chance to choose which approach to use, and both of them are accessible and available, I would totally argue for based on genetic horizons. For those of you who are not in soil science, this is the kind of interesting continuous debates that happen between, especially those focused on pedology and soil development. They have obviously a lot more appreciation for the information that you get by describing soils, getting into the classification schemes, and even the horizonation. And if you do so, I think you get a lot out of it, but it's not always possible. So for example, some of the climate change manipulation experiments that I've worked in, you just simply do not have a chance to dig the pit and describe layers because you have limited area for the whole experiment, and the experiment's supposed to go on, for 10, 20 years. And so you can't keep disrupting the soil. So you just take a small core in as many places as you can to make your measurements representative.
I have a couple other questions coming in here. So Michael Kaiser asks, as you upscaled the soil organic carbon amounts in deep soil from the Sierra Nevadas, did you account for differences in land use?
No, so this is as back of the envelope a calculation as it will get. We're very open about this issue in the paper that's hopefully in the last steps of review right now. And there's no way that we can, the estimates that we're making are as hand wavy as it can get, right? We're assuming based on distribution of paramaterials across the world and things we know about climate, that this is how deep soils are likely to be. But the estimates that we have don't account for differences in land use or even differences in topography so biota in general even. So there's bound to be, that's why in that table, if you remember when I showed you, there's a lot of variability in estimates. I'll go back to remind you, I went through this rather quickly, but there's a big error around, so standard deviations are pretty big around these estimates. So they're as back of the envelope as any estimate could be. But to our knowledge, this is the first time that anybody has estimated the amount of carbon that could potentially be stored in weathered bedrock around the world. So we see this as an initial starting point for further work, not a definitive number. I hope I answered Michael's question.
The next question I have is, fascinating talk. In the Davis project, the deep carbon was sensitive to water pulses. Would you expect similar response from soils in biomes that are less water limited?
No, I think that's an important point. This is definitely characteristic of a Mediterranean type of ecosystem that through much of the year is water limited. So if the soil is not limited, by water, and if the deep soil layer is regularly seeing a lot of water, I would expect that it wouldn't be this sensitive to change in precipitation or amount of water, if you will, on soil. It's a big part of this story is really about how much moisture and fluctuation in moisture and temperature deep soils are actually used to seeing, right? We don't expect deep soils to see much fluctuation in temperature or moisture, for that matter, as much as surface soils. And I think a big part of this result that we see here is reflecting that limited exposure to fluctuations in moisture and temperature that deep soils see. And hence, when they do see, kind of this new, if you will, fluctuation, a lot of that carbon can be destabilized that's in deep soil layers.
And I also have just a comment here, not a question. Just major thanks from a non-soil scientist. This was incredibly accessible and very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
And here's another question. What are some of the current risks facing deep soils weathered bedrock?
So generally speaking, this layer, at best, even in the Sierra, I'll show you the kind of the depth ranges we're talking about so that this point becomes easier, right? So at best, this layer of soil that we're discussing is, even in the systems we studied, about 1.5 meters below the soil surface. So it's not facing huge amount of vulnerability, if you will, from most human activities. But if climate was to change, and if climate was to change in a manner that changes flow rates of water, or even extent to which roots grow and where roots can live and die, basically, then the amount of carbon stored in deep soil layers becomes vulnerable. In fact, a large part of what we're studying in the Nebraska site is about vulnerability of these deep carbon when it's exposed to moisture. Then it's exposed just moisture by itself, but also moisture along with fresh organic matter, akin to what would happen from exposure to exudates that roots produce, or even nutrients that may become available to roots. So if these kinds of conditions were to change, we're trying to understand how much of this carbon can be exposed to loss, in particular to oxidative loss. From what we're seeing in the Nebraska site so far, it's very hard to activate the carbon in these soils to decomposition. At the very least, you need a decent amount of water and nutrients to be available to help the microbes basically wake up. But the study that was done by both, this paper that we recently published in biogeochemistry, but also this paper that I mentioned from Kathleen Hicks-Priest, they're both looking at two different stories of climate. So Kathleen's paper had this deep soil warming experiment. So they put rods deep into the soil to warm the soil up to 1 meter depth. and they followed the response of CO2 to that warming in deep soil layers. That was a 4-degree increase in temperature in deep soil layers. They saw quite a significant change in CO2 production and loss from deep soils at 4-degree C change. And as you saw from Davis, we also see quite a significant change when moisture dynamics change. So what those two stories plus what we're learning from Nebraska tell me is that the carbon that is in the CR layers may very well be hard to activate. But the carbon that is, a meter or so below the soil surface, though, might be a lot more vulnerable than we assumed previously. Because relatively speaking, there's a lot more carbon in the lighter shades of gray, basically in this figure, than in the dark shades of gray, right? And so the whatever carbon's available in the CR layer is bound with minerals. It's relatively harder to decompose. It's also lower concentration. So microbes just have to work a lot harder to get to it. But if it's available in higher concentrations, and even if there are more nutrients available and environmental conditions are right, though, if the conditions, the temperature or moisture conditions change towards where they are more favorable for microbes to decompose organic matter, in about a meter or so, they seem to be perfectly well capable to do it. And the responses are pretty clear that soil, especially A and B horizon, organic matter that is exposed to change in temperature and precipitation patterns tends to be very sensitive to climate, and causes quite a loss of a lot of CO2, but CR less so, from everything that we've learning. But then again, that's what you would expect, I think. It's just been very important and nice to see it quantified and verified with measurement too.
Well, I don't see any other questions coming through, so I'll say thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. I learned a lot, and I think I'm speaking for everyone. And thank you, everyone, for attending the seminar. And
thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Jess.